Hello, everyone. My name's Devin Kellis, and I am a third-year medical student at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, Columbia. I'm also an AMA Journal of Ethics editorial fellow, and I was in charge of their August 2025 issue, Existential Health Care Ethics, that was just released in commemoration of the 80th anniversaries of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wanted to welcome you to this webinar hosted by IPPNW on the Ethics of Human Extinction, Medical Perspectives 80 Years After Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can go into the next slide. I just wanted to give a brief disclaimer that the positions presented in this webinar belong to each individual speaker and do not represent the views of IPPNW, the AMA Journal of Ethics, or other presenters. And you can find the AMA Journal of Ethics special issue on existential healthcare ethics at the link that's on this page. And now I'm going to turn it over to IPPNW's Program Director, Molly McGinty, who's going to give some brief background information on IPPNW and the recent anniversaries.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I'd like to give a brief caveat that I am filling in for Dr. Ruth Mitchell, who is IPPNW's Board of Directors. So I don't have any formal remarks set, but I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming today and for hearing from our fabulous speakers who contributed to this special issue. Like Devin said, I am the program director with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We are a global federation of health professionals committed to the abolition of nuclear weapons. We recognize that there can be no meaningful health response to the catastrophic impacts of nuclear weapons, and thus we have to prevent this catastrophe by eliminating these weapons in total. We primarily do that through the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is the first comprehensive ban of nuclear weapons. We're a nonpartisan and non-political federation that really focuses our work on the health and humanitarian impacts of these weapons. We look at what they do to humans and we look at what they do to the environment. That starts obviously with the beginning of the nuclear age and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just these two bombs 80 years ago killed over 200,000 people before the end of the year. As we commemorate this solemn anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we recognize that today we face the most acute threat of nuclear war. We're closer to nuclear war than we've ever been before. And it's up to all of us as health professionals, as advocates, as people who care about humanity and want to prevent any form of human extinction, that nuclear weapons are a threat to all of us. So today, we push forward what IPPNW's message has always been, that we must prevent what we cannot cure. I'm so excited to hear from, again, the contributors of this special issue, which includes some of our IPPNW medical students, Devin included. So really, really excited to get into this today, to honor the legacy of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors and to look toward the work ahead. So thanks again for having us, and a special thank you to our friends at the American Medical Association's Journal of Ethics. I'll pass it back to Devin.
Thank you, Molly. You can go ahead and pull up the first set of slides. All right, so I'm going to talk today giving kind of an introduction to the special issue. The first article was entitled Existential Health Care Ethics. This is going to be somewhat of a whirlwind, and I picked this background for the slide because this topic is far from simple, and this short presentation definitely won't do the concepts justice. Next slide. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of thinking about human extinction. Oftentimes, thinking about the end of the world has been the domain of religion, and increasingly over the past 250 years or so, science has been investigating different ways that humanity could go extinct. One of our speakers today, Dr. Torres, has kind of outlined different moods in history where people had thought about extinction in different ways. The first being when extinction was largely unthinkable, or what he calls an unintelligible impossibility. And he'll talk to us a little bit more about why that was in his talk upcoming. And another key point is that we didn't always understand the concept of extinction. It used to be the case that people just thought things existed forever. But a physician and surgeon actually discovered this concept of extinction by looking at fossil evidence. And then later, someone named George Cuvier popularized the idea and kind of made it well known. And then it wasn't until the mid-19th century when what's called the second mood started in Torres's terminology, when the first kill mechanism or scientific way that humanity could cease to exist was discovered. And this was actually the second law of thermodynamics, which was about entropy and how energy in the universe tends to just not be created or destroyed, and it just tends towards disorder. And this was discovered by Carnot, Clausius, and Kelvin. And ever since this happened, people would ask kind of two types of questions. The first kind of questions are empirical questions about whether or not it's scientifically possible for humans to go extinct. And if it is, how does it happen? And this ultimately falls into the domain of extinction biology, although a lot of different science bears on this, such as chemistry and physics, planetary sciences, and many more. An entire different set of questions are ethical questions. If we were to go extinct, would it be good or bad? And why or why not? And moreover, if someone's action were to cause human extinction, would those actions be right or wrong? And these questions fall into the domain of what's called extinction ethics, or sometimes also called existential ethics or the ethics of human extinction. Next slide. And so going from left to right here, I'm going to cover a variety of different thoughts about the reality of entropy, which led to this concept of the heat death of the universe, or the fact that the sun would eventually burn out. Hermann von Helmholtz was a physician and scientist who gave a lecture on the topic, and he essentially thought that this was so far into the future and not a big deal to him at the time. And so he thought that humanity had higher moral problems before it. And so he kind of triaged the issue. The philosopher Philip Mainlander, however, thought that humanity's eventual extinction through entropic death would be great because there'd be no more human suffering. And sadly, he ended up committing suicide after writing his thesis. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the other hand, denied heat death at all. He wouldn't accept that it would be a possibility. And he famously claimed that God is dead and that there are no objective ethics. And so people have to figure out their own ethics and become what he called Übermenschen. And this concept would later go on to influence Nazi ideology. And after Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace thought of the idea of evolution by natural selection, those sorts of concepts got tied into the ideas of eugenics with Francis Galton. And among the Nazis, they became very concerned about the extinction of the Aryan race. And it was kind of this mesh of ideas, which wasn't the only thing that drove the Holocaust, but helped facilitate the direct killing of many millions of people. And then more recently, around the time of World War II, Hans Jonas interpreted entropy from the view of cosmic nihilism, that what is the meaning of the universe if eventually humanity will cease to exist? And more recently in pop culture, these ideas are still circulating, and many people still try to figure out ways to avoid entropic death, even though that is likely not going to be possible. Next slide. And so in Dr. Torres's chronology, the development of nuclear weapons, use of them in war, and especially the use of them in nuclear testing initiated a new mood of thinking about human extinction. Molly has already indicated that over 200,000 people were killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki by these weapons. And at the height of the Cold War, there was over 60,000 of them. And there's still many more that remain today. IPPNW's work would come around in the 1980s, but there are also other people working on human survival with respect to the environment, many people concerned about population size. And one physician, Roger Rawls, wrote a book called Staying Alive, The Psychology of Human Survival, which was one of the first books that actually took a variety of different threats to humanity and evaluated them under the same lens. And after kind of this, around this same time, people started to discover asteroid impact craters and also supervolcanic eruptions, and begin thinking about how these physical mechanisms could have led to past extinctions. And near the end of the 20th century, after IPPNW had done a lot of the work that Molly mentioned, and that we're going to hear more about later in this series of talks, Richard Smith, the editor of the BMJ, called for IPPNW to spread its mission to all of global security. And one other thing I wanted to mention is after World War II, the World Medical Association actually adopted their first international code of medical ethics. And they stated that all physicians should solemnly pledge to consecrate themselves to the service of humanity. Interestingly, however, now in the 2022 code, the word humanity no longer appears. And I think that should be something we should be concerned about. Next slide. And so I mentioned how Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch influenced Nazi eugenics. And after World War II, as the concepts of human rights became more formalized, including by one eugenicist, Julian Huxley, which is shown here on the bottom left, he started to develop a new idea, which he called evolutionary humanism. And he actually intended for this to be a new secular religion. And he later termed it as transhumanism. And in many ways, these views became the successor of the eugenics concept of the 20th century and has been building ever since then. And in the early 21st century, Nick Bostrom coined the word existential risk and defined it as any threat that would annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or drastically curtail its potential. And this is a two-part definition, which is very ambiguous in the sense that it's not referencing humanity, it's just referencing Earth-originating intelligent life, and it's combining extinction and potential, which leaves open the possibility that an existential risk can be anything that doesn't just threaten extinction, but threatens any potential future values, whether that might be colonizing the entire universe, as many people will advocate ever since the space age, also in the 20th century. And so this idea of humanity's potential got tied in with space colonization. And as people began to understand that the universe was expanding and that there is a finite number of planets or star systems that could potentially be reached where humans can actually go to, people started to think like, oh no, we actually have to make sure we don't go extinct so we can colonize the universe. And this is a really odd idea, but it's become extremely popular among billionaires and two philosophical worldviews called effective altruism and long-termism. And essentially, this is one way of thinking about it is that with the eugenics movement of the 20th century, you had concern about enhancing humanity through eugenics in the direct violation of human rights. But now you have the concept of transhumanism, enhancing humanity through genetic engineering, technological enhancement, and things of this nature. And that has been reinterpreted through the lens of existential risk. And so not only are these people concerned about extinction of humanity, they're concerned that extinction would not lead them to achieve some post-human future where they become a new species, they live much longer, and they colonize the universe. And Molly Gleiberman, a scholar, actually terms this X-risk transhumanitarianism. And it's a way of conveying a threat to a potential future, which makes it sound like actions are very humanitarian, but it actually leads to investments that deprioritize some of the most vulnerable people in our communities and leads many of them to die. And this is a process known as structural violence. And it's just something I thought we should think about. Next slide. And so in that context, I wanted to give an example of how this actually plays out in the real world. And so at a recent SpaceX event, Elon Musk gave his timeline for colonizing Mars over the next roughly 8 years. And at the same time he was doing this, he had recently helped dismantle the United States Agency for International Development, which has saved over 20 million lives, I believe, in the 21st century alone, roughly. Now, there was a recent report came out from The Lancet that demonstrated a prediction where between 2025 to 2030, potentially 14 million individuals and 4.5 million children younger than the age of 5 might die due to the loss of this funding. And this shows and demonstrates how you can have someone who's saying they're doing things for the good of humanity, but what they really mean is post-humanity and the vast, glorious future that they see humanity achieving, while at the same time, not only just letting people die, but taking direct actions that lead them to die. And it's not even clear if the project of colonizing Mars is super feasible, and it might actually increase extinction risk. As the scholar Daniel Dewdney put it, the dinosaurs, they tell us, were wiped out because they didn't have a space program. I say the dinosaurs lasted 200 million years because they didn't have a space program. Next slide. And so just a couple final thoughts before we move on to the next talk. The way I presented things today was nowhere near as complicated as it really is. It's easy to think about these topics as black and white, or all wrong or all right, but we have to think about things in the real world as it's very complicated, and try to critically analyze things and not just go with what our gut tells us, and try to learn as much as we can about these threats and how they have downstream consequences for health. And so there are other physicians outside of IPPNW, including Dr. Stephen Luby, who have been working on the problem of human extinction for about a decade now. He founded the Existential Risk Initiative, and that term existential risk is in their institute's title, but Dr. Luby views it in a more common parlance manner. So he thinks an existential risk is not just something to humanity's long-term future, but it can be, a threat to humanity today. And I didn't talk very much about the planetary health movement, but I think it's very important doing this sort of research going into the future to not just talk about individual threats, but to understand the underlying drivers behind those threats, including the neural mechanisms and behavioral mechanisms that lead people to behave in the sorts of ways that they've been behaving. And in my view, the ultimate goal of this work is to promote what I call humanity's health span. It's not just how long humanity can exist, but also how much equality there is during that existence, what that existence is like, and how well-being is distributed in the population throughout that time. Next slide.
I think that's the final slide I have.
Yeah, I meant, sorry, for the next presenter. And so our next talk is going to be Dr. Emil P. Torres. They are a postdoctoral scholar at the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Their work focuses on existential threats and threats to civilization, and on the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction. They have a recent book published in 2024, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So the article that I published was titled 4 Key Concepts in Existential Health Care Ethics. Next slide. I'll just provide a brief overview of the key ideas that are discussed in the paper. The first of which is this very important distinction between when it comes to talking about the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction, it's crucial to differentiate between 2 aspects of extinction. One is the process or event of going extinct, and the other is the subsequent state of being extinct. So these can be easily conflated, and the argument that I have made in a number of articles, not just this one, but some others I've published recently that have drawn from part 2 of my book on human extinction that was published last year. The claim is that all of the main positions within the field of the ethics of human extinction or existential ethics, whichever term you prefer, only make sense with in reference to this distinction between going extinct and being extinct. So, for example, there are some positions that claim the badness or the wrongness of human extinction comes down entirely to the details of going extinct. So, two examples would be like Scanlonian contractualism and a person affecting interpretation of utilitarianism, such as the one that was famously defended by a philosopher named Jan Narveson in, I think, starting in 1967. And so the implications of these positions are that if there is nothing bad or wrong about the process of going extinct, there's nothing bad or wrong about extinction, period. Right? So an examination of the details of going extinct exhausts your assessment of human extinction. The subsequent state of being extinct is just morally irrelevant. And one reason that you could give for thinking this is that if there's nobody around to suffer or bemoan the non-existence of humanity, then who exactly has been harmed? And if nobody's been harmed, then where is the wrong or the bad? Right? Can you point to it? You can't. Therefore, there's nothing bad or wrong about being extinct. So there are other views that vociferously disagree with this, and they, like long-termism, for example, transhumanism, totalist utilitarianism. Yet another example, they would argue that being extinct is very morally relevant. And consequently, human extinction introduces a unique moral problem, right? Because human extinction, unlike every other possible catastrophe or scenario, would preclude the realization of all future value. So this actually gets at the second point, which is specifically, I personally don't endorse the second claim, but it is an implication of these views that say being extinct is very morally important, right? So you could imagine a scenario that results in a growing number of people perishing. The number of casualties might be on the x-axis. Badness, if you follow along, badness would be on the y-axis. So as more and more individuals perish in this catastrophe, the badness increases. Once you reach 100% of the population disappearing, the individuals who think being extinct is morally important would say that the badness suddenly skyrockets, right? Because it's at that exact moment, the moment of extinction, that you lose all future value. Potentially huge numbers of future people. All of the opportunity costs are suddenly obtained at that point. Individuals who agree basically with my position that going extinct is all that really matters would say that once 100% you reach that critical moral threshold of 100% of humanity dying off, the badness suddenly plateaus. It just doesn't get any worse. Why? Because being extinct is morally irrelevant. So those are the first 2 points. Take a quick sip of water. There's another issue that almost nobody, as far as I know, within the literature on the ethics of human extinction has discussed or really recognized, which is that the term human extinction does not have, I'll put it differently. The term human extinction can have multiple different definitions because each of those two terms could be interpreted in multiple different ways. So the term human extinction is doubly ambiguous. I'll give you a very quick example. So there are two human extinction scenarios. One is where our species dies out, full stop. The other is where we die out and we fail to produce any successors, right? So imagine two people, Sally and Tom, they're having a conversation. They start off by saying, I agree that human extinction ought to be avoided. It's very important that we avoid human extinction. But an hour later, they're in this back and forth shouting at each other. Well, what happened? One possibility is, let's just say that what Sally means by human extinction is that she wants our species, our particular species, Homo sapiens, to survive. Tom, on the other hand, says, no, what I want is to create a new post-human species to take the place of our species. And our survival matters only insofar, it only matters insofar as our survival is necessary to produce these successors, right? Once post-humanity arrives, the survival of humanity doesn't matter, right? So these are two different kinds of extinction scenarios. A lot of the people, so I call these terminal extinction and final extinction. And a lot of the people right now who are long-termists and transhumanists and so on, who are talking about human extinction, are talking about final extinction, not terminal extinction. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't disambiguate the term human extinction. So the third point, and I'll end here in 20 seconds, the third point is just highlighting the importance of properly defining the terms that we're using, because human extinction has, I mentioned two definitions. There's a whole wide range of ways that one could and people have in the literature interpreted and defined those terms. So the fourth point I will skip over for now. Devin touched on the issue a bit, but this is a brief synoptic overview of some of the key ideas within the paper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Torres, for that good overview of some key concepts in existential ethics. In our next talk, I'm going to build off on what Dr. Torres said and go into a little bit more detail about two particular positions in ethics of human extinction. And so this is based on a paper that me and Dr. Torres wrote for the special issue, How Might Healthcare Think About the Ethics of Human Extinction? Next slide. Okay, so Dr. Torres came up with this thought experiment where you have to consider two hypothetical worlds, world A and world B. In world A, there's 11 billion people in existence, but in world B, there's 10 billion. However, in both worlds, a global catastrophe, such as a nuclear war, causes exactly 10 billion people to die. In world A, 10 billion people die, but extinction has not occurred, and 1 billion people survive. Whereas in world B, extinction has occurred. And so some questions that we might ask about this is there any reason to believe that what has happened in world A or world B is better or worse, or is it the same morally? And if someone were to cause the catastrophes in world A or world B, would they have done something extra morally wrong in world B than they did in A? And the question this gets at is there an important ethical difference between a global catastrophe that causes human extinction and one that does not, if the events that actually bring about that extinction are otherwise exactly the same? And it turns out that what view one takes on this particular question ends up having very important implications for healthcare, but also society as a whole. Some views on this question would suggest that healthcare is radically unethical, but it might also turn out to be the case that healthcare voices could go against those views and help explain why that wouldn't be the case. Next slide. And so the way I want to show the relevance of this question is by imagining that we're having a debate at the UN Security Council, which its permanent members include 5 nuclear armed states. On one side, we're going to have the equivalence view, which essentially states that the badness of human extinction depends solely on the events that bring it about. Nothing else, just what happens. The further loss arguments, however, would state that it's not just how extinction comes about, but it's all of the various future losses, such as future happiness, future people, etc., that could have existed if humanity did not go extinct. On the equivalence view, for healthcare, It's very important that we prevent extinction-causing catastrophes because they would harm a lot of people in many cases. A nuclear war would kill millions, even likely billions of people. However, as Dr. Torres was mentioning earlier, if humanity did go extinct through other mechanisms that did not cause harm, say people just decided to stop having children voluntarily, this would never happen, of course, but it's just a thought experiment. In that case, people would not be harmed in the same way as a nuclear war. And so after the fact, when humanity is no longer around, there's no longer any people to be around to be harmed. And so extinction cannot be bad. Only the things that lead to extinction can be bad. And that is the equivalence view. And under the equivalence view, you would prioritize eliminating harms to people as they happen today. And this is in stark contrast to radical further loss views. One example that Dr. Torres mentioned was long-termism. And these views at the extreme would say that the future could be so vast in both space and time, depending on the exact physical theory of the universe that ends up being correct. If the universe is going to end in what's called a big rip, there's some suggestion that the universe might last for 200 billion years. However, depending on the value of certain physical constants, the universe could potentially last much longer than that, and so could potentially some stars before they die out. And so some proponents of the further loss view, some people in popular culture that might endorse this view include Elon Musk, who we already talked about previously as well. They would say, well, we could have so many future people if we could colonize the solar system. And not only the solar system, but the Kuiper Belt, which is just outside of it with icy rocks. And then the Oort cloud, we could get there as well. And then we could travel all the way to Proxima Centauri b, and we could colonize it. Then we could just travel throughout the Milky Way and the local group and the Virgo supercluster and the Laniakea supercluster, all throughout the cosmic web and the effectable universe. This is the type of radical further loss view, which, if discussed at the Security Council, if it won out, it would essentially mean we have such a huge future in front of us, we can't worry about the present and the people being harmed today, because there's going to be so many future people and we should focus on them. So don't prioritize the people who are suffering today, because there's just going to be so many future people in the universe, and it's going to be great in the future. And the question here is, if this is the view that you take, the further loss position, at what point do you say you've colonized enough of the universe? You know, the universe is so big that this would be nearly an infinite process for several billions of years until you just couldn't reach any other planets. And at what point would the further loss theorists say, hey, we're going to stop and we're going to take care of people around today? And so this would be where the equivalence views would say, we have to have some trade-off here. We can't just say that we're going to make humanity live as long as physically possible within the universe and not care about equality, autonomy, health, well-being. Because if we do that, many people will live terrible lives. And that's simply not acceptable. Next slide. And so these issues are particularly important for medical professionals because the World Medical Association has stated, quote, that physicians also have a responsibility to contribute to the health and well-being of the populations the physician serves and society as a whole, including future generations. And also that physicians should strive to practice medicine in a ways that are environmentally sustainable with a view to minimizing environmental health risks to current and future generations. Now, this brings a lot of questions to the table. Does this just mean that we should make future generations have lives that are good? Or does it mean that we should make more future generations? And if it means we should make more future generations, how many future generations? And you can see how this could become very problematic under a further loss view, because there's just so many people that could exist in the future. How are you ever going to prioritize people in the present? Next slide. And so some recommendations that Dr. Torres and I suggest might be avenues for advocacy. The first being working to get countries to agree to and this is very idealistic, of course, but contributing 1% of global GDP to global health and life-saving humanitarian aid. We came up with this number based on a similar number that was proposed by the long-termist Toby Ord of giving 1% of GDP to mitigating existential risk, which is not strictly human extinction, as we saw earlier in the seminar. My intuition is that it might be better to allocate about 0.01% of GDP to human extinction management. The current GDP is about $100 trillion. And so 1% would be 1 trillion, 0.1% would be 100 billion, and 0.01% would be 10 billion. After doing some research on this, I feel about $10 billion would be an extremely large amount of money that could make a lot of progress on understanding human extinction. But I still think we should be giving more money to global health and life-saving humanitarian aid. Another option that we're considering is developing a new medical specialty of extinction medicine to focus specifically on the problems related to human extinction. And I'm going to discuss that later on in the seminar. And then lastly, and I think this is probably one of the ones I'm most interested in, is developing an independent scientific panel on human extinction to figure out the actual empirical science of the ways that humanity could go extinct, what we do know, what we don't know, and to think about these things as rigorously as can be possible. And we're ready for the next speaker. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Bruce E. Tan. He is the president of 33 Inc., a scientific and educational nonprofit located in Knoxville, Tennessee. Dr. Tan is an internationally known academic futurist and has published extensively on the topic of obligations to future generations and human extinction. He holds degrees from Stanford, Harvard, and Northwestern universities, and has recently published the book Anticipation, Sustainability, Futures, and Human Extinction: Ensuring Humanity's Journey into the Distant Future.
Thank you, Devin. I want to recognize my co-author, my son, Dr. Christopher Tan. He's a ear, nose, and throat surgeon. He just left the military and is going to move to Everett, Washington to take a private practice next month. Next slide. So a little bit about 3 cubed. There's actually superscript in our name, which we think is very important. Yes, we're a 501c3 nonprofit located in Knoxville. We do social science and future studies research, and we work with stakeholders in the community quite a bit. We focus on historically underserved individuals and populations, which we say also includes future generations. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Tennessee, and I also worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory as a social scientist and policy researcher for over 30 years. And relevant to this gathering today, back in 1985, the 40th anniversary of Hiroshima was noted, and a Japanese researcher who was part of the first team to arrive on the scene at Hiroshima was the keynote speaker. And he brought on little preprints of the article they published with pictures and data they collected. And it was, for me, it was quite an emotional and historic event. Next slide. So I've been publishing in the future studies literature since the late 1980s. And as a futurist, we tend to think, we do rely on philosophers and philosophical thought quite a bit, but we tend to frame things in terms of obligations to future generations, of which preventing human extinction is an ethical and moral obligation for current generations, along with bequeathing, other perpetual obligations like bequeathing sustainable societies, preventing the extinction of all life on Earth, maintaining options for future generations, and a no regret obligation that I first read about by the futurist Wendell Bell, that we have an obligation not to go extinct because humanity has some major things and some great things that you're going to achieve in the future. My son, who's a physician, he said, physicians take an oath to do no harm. And through our discussions, I think we came to this conclusion that physicians have an ethical and moral responsibility to help humanity avoid the ultimate harm to future generations, their non-existence. Next slide, please. So as Devin mentioned, I've been publishing in papers on the topics of obligations to future generations and a book and so on. But it's very, very hard, extremely difficult to motivate humanity to think about human extinction. Every day is a challenge when you're worrying about this topic and not making much progress. My son said within medicine, it's his view that sometimes Western medicine still struggles with addressing end-of-life issues with individuals. And we came to the conclusion that maybe a metaphor of one patient at a time could be useful in addressing both end-of-life issues and human extinction policy. Next slide. Practical recommendations. There aren't that many graduate programs in future studies in the world, and there's only a handful in the United States, but those programs could be broadened to move more from, let's say, applied futures, where they're teaching students to think about scenarios and trends that may impact organizations or companies, to take this broader view, which I'm going to use the term transcendental futures, that you're doing all these things. We have sustainable development goals and so on, and they have transcendent values associated with them. I think that those kinds of ideas can be brought into futures education, and also feature in futures conferences, such as held by the Association of Professional Futurists. And conversely, these kinds of topics, as Devin hinted at, can be brought into medical education and maybe even continuing education in the medical area. We were looking for a term that kind of bridged the top-down futurist perspective and the bottom-up, one patient at a time perspective, and we focused on the term descendants. So I'm going to try to talk to more people about preventing human extinction using the concept of descendants. These are you're going to save the lives of your descendants, your grandchildren and their children and their children. And discussing human extinction with patients could be also use the word descendants to help with those conversations. One thing we didn't really make a lot of progress on is how would physicians, one patient at a time, discuss human extinction, and under what context would they do that? I think that's an open research question, but I think this, again, focusing on the concept of descendants might be an entry to have these kinds of discussions. Last slide, please, or next slide. And we thought about, okay, is there a topic that kind of bridges futurists and medical community that we're maybe facing right now? And we settled on this example of fertility from a futurist perspective. Prolonged fertility, a prolonged decline in fertility rates below replacement levels poses a risk to human extinction. It's just a math problem. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but if it were to extend on, it wouldn't take that long for humanity to go extinct. So futurists can help understand how quickly this can happen and the harms that would happen in between with respect to collapsing societies or aging societies and so on. And we know medicine can help reverse some biological factors that are related to decreasing levels of fertility, but it may also be ethically appropriate for physicians to engage one patient at a time to discuss this particular risk to humanity. So something to think about. And I think I'm done. I think just have one more slide, a thank you slide. And if you want to contact me at 3Cube, there's my email address. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tan. We're going to move on to the next presentation. which is going to be by Dr. Charles S. Bryan, a physician, and Hayward Gibbs, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Internal Medicine at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, Columbia. He formerly served as the chair of the Department of Medicine and director of the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities at the University of South Carolina. His publications are mainly in the areas of infectious disease, medical history, and medical biography, with particular interest in Sir William Osler.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you again for your incredible leadership in putting together this symposium.
Looks like we just lost Dr. Bryan. Oh, here he is.
Next slide, first slide, next slide. My topic is virtue, ethics, and postponing human extinction. And I come back to the idea that in 1970, the term bioethics was rediscovered in separate contexts. And the usual one is that of Sergeant Shriver, who, sitting in his living room in Bethesda, Maryland, with Kennedy relatives who were trying to found a center for ethics as applied to patient care dilemmas, came up with the term bioethics. But the first published definition was by a scientist named Van Rensselaer Potter, who was in the field of oncology, who defined bioethics as a science of human survival in which biology must be taken into account. In 2000, the year 2000, I became director of a Center for Bioethics, and I wrote a little manual about bioethics and professionalism. And I was struck by the fact that none of my colleagues in that center ever expressed appreciation for or interest in Potter's definition, which is the one that concerns us today. The next slide indicates that Potter went on to write fairly extensively in bioethics, defining it as a bridge to the future, and in what I regard as a seminal book, outlined many of the issues as we see them today. But he, probably borrowing from Buckminster Fuller's publication, expressed the concern that nobody is at the controls of Spaceship Earth, or even in the United States, that humankind does not really seem concerned about its own survival, which certainly resonates with the overarching thesis of our webinar today. May I have the next slide? The questions are the efforts to postpone extinction worthwhile? I would say yes, arguing from the viewpoint of cosmic consciousness. One can make other arguments, as Dr. Torres did, but postponing extinction would deprive the known universe of an agent that can appreciate with awe and wonder its majesty and the incredible reality that we are alive. I frequently ponder the fact that the odds against any one of us being here today exceed 400 trillion to 1, probably much greater than that. And so from that viewpoint alone, I feel the obligation to pass it on, as I think most people should. If yes, then who should make the key decisions? And it seems fairly clear to me that this cannot be vested in national leaders because they have their self-interest. William Osler said that nationalism has been the great curse of humanity, and I think we would all agree on that point, given the global situation today. In my opinion, at least, and I think certainly not alone in this regard, that there should be something akin to the United Nations Security Council, which should make the preservation of sentient life and other higher life forms on this planet its primary concern, and their power should be enforceable. How should decision makers go about making decisions? We'll get to that in a moment. But does it matter whether these people are of good character? And that gets to the point of what do we mean by character? And it turns out on the next slide that character is the sum of the virtues and virtues are the components of character. The major types of ethical theories well known to this audience include deontology, duties or rules, and consequentialism, or especially utilitarianism or results. Most debates about the wedge issues, such as abortion or physician-assisted suicide or gun control, et cetera, reveal among the participants the distinct voices of the deontologists and the consequentialists. Virtue ethics is sometimes viewed as a standalone theory of ethics, dating back to Plato and other philosophers in classic Greece, that a person of virtue will usually do the right thing, but I think most of us would see it as a supplement to deontologic and consequentialist theories of ethics. And so then, as per the next slide, what are the virtues? And I've often been struck that nobody today, including learned philosophers and theologians and the like, can ask, what are the cardinal virtues? Name the cardinal virtues. In fact, my interest in virtue theory began in the late 1970s during a game of Trivial Pursuit with my wife, when the question came up on one of the Trivial Pursuit cards, what are the cardinal virtues? And I knew the card would have the answer wrong because it asked for 3 of them, not 4. Cardinal virtues from Plato are wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, whereas the transcendent virtues, which was the answer on the card, are faith, hope, and love. I would draw your attention to justice among the cardinal virtues. Justice is the only cardinal virtue, which is also one of the 4 Beecham and Childress principles of biomedical ethics. The others being, of course, beneficence and non-maleficence, seen as opposite sides of the same coin, and patient autonomy. Patient autonomy has ruled in the clinical ethics movement, which began in earnest during the late 1970s and 1980s. But I think ultimately, with the overarching ethics of extinction, which will be a messy business, we might have to surrender a lot of a lot of individual autonomy in the interest of the good of the whole, which gets back to the ancient Greece idea of civic virtue, the individual having an obligation to society, or in this case, to the perpetuation of life. Next slide simply summarizes the fact, or illustrates the fact, that there's been a lot of recent work on the what I regard as the 7 classic virtues of antiquity, which gives me the optimism that perhaps, just perhaps, by combining numerous disciplines, including moral philosophy and sociology and future studies, as Dr. Tan suggested, and the type of emphasis that Devin has brought to us, just perhaps we may be able to improve our exercise of these basic virtues, particularly wisdom, and we now even have an emerging idea of artificial wisdom. I'm intrigued by the idea that the lower parts of the brain, particularly the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, tend to be responsible for our moral reasoning, whereas the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has more to do with the cold utilitarian reasoning. We clearly need both, but to me, this idea, this construct, resonates the idea with the idea that love, which we would all agree is the highest of the transcendent virtues, should inform wisdom, which is the highest of the cardinal virtues in the key decisions for ethical decision making in the field of extinction ethics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan, for that presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Amber Comer. She is the Director of Ethics Policy and the Secretary of the Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs at the American Medical Association in Chicago, Illinois. She is also an Associate Professor of Health Sciences and Medicine at Indiana University. Dr. Comer is an expert in medical decision-making for patients with critical illness. Dr. Comer.
I just realized nobody could hear me. Hi, it is so nice to be with all of you today. I'm Dr. Amber Comer, and today I'm going to take an approach that I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to try to answer it with practical answers in ethics and law. And so the question I want to pose is, do you have a right to exist in the face of environmental existential threats, including nuclear war? Next slide. In my recent article for the AMA Journal of Ethics, I examined whether there is a right to protection against existential environmental threats. And in this article, I distinguish human rights from legal rights, and I consider possible domestic and international legal approaches to rights-based protection from environmental existential threats. And I offer recommendations about how to motivate such protections. And so some of the important key parts from the article is that human rights refer to entitlements that all humans have simply on the basis of being born human, whereas legal rights stem from a human right that is protected by law and has tangible protection and consequences for violation. So we're talking about ethics and then the implementation of ethics through law. So while internationally some human rights are recognized, not all of these human rights are considered legal rights throughout the world. So some examples of recognized human rights include the right to life, the right to health, and the right to water or shelter. And depending on what nation you're in, you might see that your nation actually has codified these human rights into legal rights. Yet one fundamental question still lingers that's relevant to our talk today. Do we have a right to a clean and sustainable environment, which is the very condition that makes all other rights possible? This framing highlights a paradox, where the law protects life that was once it's endangered, but it is far less clear about protecting the conditions that sustain that life in the first place. Next slide. Consider the scope of modern environmental collapse. We are on the brink of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. And these are not marginal issues, as they pose dangers on a scale that threatens not just individuals, but humanity itself. In 2022, the United Nations General Assembly affirmed a right to a healthy environment. And while this was symbolically important, in practice, it's largely unenforceable because it's a non-binding resolution. So while the United States does also not recognize this right. But there is something really unusual that's happened in the United States, and this is something that I cover in my Joe article, is that an individual state, Montana, chose to exercise their rights when youth plaintiffs successfully argued that their constitutional rights had been violated by inadequate climate protections. So this is a very unusual case. It was among the first of its kind. And so cases like this, where people are arguing that they have a constitutional right to a clean environment, is rare, fragile, and heavily contested. And the paradox in the United States is that states have duties to protect individuals once life is already in danger, but there's no clear, proactive legal obligation to prevent the degradation of the environment that sustains those same lives. And so we face a gap in human rights implementation because law is reactive to immediate threats, but weak in preventing existential ones. If you could click the slide. So that brings us to nuclear war. And this legal and ethical gap becomes even starker when we consider the possibility of nuclear war. Next slide. Nuclear weapons represent perhaps the ultimate existential threat. They can obliterate human populations and they can devastate the biosphere that future generations depend upon. And despite the threat to human existence, legally the situation mirrors the environmental one. That while countries recognize an interest in preserving life, there is no interest reflected in their constitutions to protect human rights laws, such as a right to health. Some nations have it, the United States does not. But a right to a clean environment or the right to an adequate standard of living, those are also rights within the United States that are not in our Constitution. And yet, as you can see, that those are the pillars that actually support having a right to life. And so it's far less clear if this duty extends to preserving conditions necessary to continue life. So despite the threat to human existence, nuclear arsenals still exist. Treaties are fragile, and there's no binding international duty to dismantle the environmental triggers of annihilation. So if we were to have nuclear war and it were to threaten these columns that actually support our right to life, even if one were to survive the initial blast, the long-lasting environmental impact may make life on Earth unbearable. And then further complicating this issue is that the impacts of environmental degradation do not adhere to arbitrary borders, meaning that a resolution to protect an environment from nuclear proliferation or degradation by one country may be completely rendered moot by their neighbors' actions. So while we like to claim that we value a right to life above all else, this right rests on several pillars, including a clean environment, health, and an adequate standard of living. And with climate collapse and nuclear war serving as threats to the very existence to humanity, I find it really hard to say that we have protections. So to put it differently, we may have protections once life is present, so once one is born, but no clear legal right to the conditions that make continued life possible. Next slide. This raises a profound ethical question. Do we conceive of rights as protecting life only once it's already threatened, or must rights extend to the ecosystems and global stability that life requires? Without such recognition, we remain perpetually vulnerable. So not just to environmental collapse, not just to nuclear annihilation, but to the silence of the law in the face of existential threats. And so we are faced with a really hard truth, that humanity lives under existential risk with no clear enforceable legal shield or clear ethical guidelines. Next slide. To me, this gap becomes even more troubling when we consider future generations. While our legal and ethical frameworks recognize the rights of the living, those who are not yet born have no legal rights at all, and our laws and ethics standards remain silent on the conditions required for life to continue in decades and centuries to come. Protecting future generations is imperative, as there's a vast body of literature showing that exposure to environmental toxins induces epigenetic and transgenerational inheritance of disease. Yet, the unborn cannot file lawsuits. They cannot demand protections. And they cannot advocate for climate stability or nuclear disarmament. And yet, the decisions that we make today will determine whether they inherit a world in which life is possible. In essence, we inherit our rights once we enter existence, but we inherit them only if existence itself has not already been destroyed. Next slide. So the challenge as I see it is twofold. First, we need to acknowledge a right to a healthy environment, not only symbolically, but with enforceable legal protections. And second, we need to extend this recognition to encompass existential threats like nuclear war. Protecting life must mean more than just preserving individual survival in emergencies. It must mean safeguarding the conditions that makes survival possible, not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us, for our children and our children's children. So to answer the question that I posed in the title of this lecture, I find it hard to say that we have a right to exist when we do not have adequate protections to actually ensure the survival of those who are already in existence, let alone those who come after us. So until the law evolves to recognize this duty, our most fundamental right, the right to not only exist today, but to continue to exist in the future, remains dangerously unprotected. Next slide. So I can take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Comer, for that talk. Let's see. So for the next talk, I'm going to briefly go over why extinction medicine should be a new medical specialty. I'm going to do this pretty quickly to allow more time for the other speakers. Next slide. So as already has been mentioned in the chat, climate change has been largely driven by high-income industrialized nations. whereas the effects of climate change actually disproportionately affect low and middle income countries. The World Health Organization, for example, in 2014, predicted that between 2030 to 2050, almost 5 million people could have climate change related deaths, and that over 90% of those individuals would be living in low and middle income countries. And shown on this slide, you can see that greenhouse gas emissions are still higher today than they were before, higher than they've ever been before, despite all the efforts that have been done to reduce them. There has been a mass published editorial recently published calling on health professionals to address this issue, and there's been a lot of progress in the planetary health movement towards that end. And recently, a lot of scholars, especially in existential risk studies, have been investigating the different pathways that climate change could lead to extinction, as shown here. Next slide. And so there are a variety of different reasons for thinking about human extinction as a healthcare or medical issue. The first is that final human extinction can only happen once. There are no do-overs. Once it happens, that's it. Second, we can't have any human values if there are no people. So human existence precedes human value. Third, extinction not only threatens people that are alive today, but all future generations. And there's some scholars who suggest that even past people could be harmed by extinction by never being remembered in the future. Fourth, it's quite possible that healthcare as an institution actually increases extinction risk through its contribution of greenhouse gas emissions, fostering competition for critical minerals and advanced biotechnology. But medical professionals have transferable skills and knowledge that can help evaluate extinction risks. And we could also start advocating for human extinction to be treated as a health issue. Next slide. I'm going to skip over to this slide for the most part. I just want to mention that at the moment, there is no profession in the world that has adopted a mission to manage extinction risk. And right now, you don't have to have any training to do that, which that just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. And I hope you might agree with that. Next slide. So in the paper, I lay out 11 competencies across 4 different domains for extinction medicine specialists to develop so that they can hopefully address the problem of extinction effectively. Next slide. And I wanted to briefly mention some of the work that's in progress that isn't currently in the paper, just to show some of the things that will be coming out in the future. So very briefly, on the bottom here, you can see different health effects of extinction threats. And in the 3 domains across the top, the extinction exposome refers to all of the different exposures that could be contributing to extinction risk. In the middle, the extinction cognitome and affectome are all the different ways that people could think about or feel about human extinction. And on the far right are all the different behaviors, the repertoire of behaviors or the behaviorum that people can exhibit when they're exposed to thinking about extinction. In the extinction exposome, there is what's called the actual threat environment. This is the nuclear weapons, the climate change, the different systems that can contribute to societal collapse. And there's also triggering factors, things that make us think about extinction. Maybe it's something like this talk or an advertisement for this talk, or maybe you see a news article about the Russia-Ukrainian war or things of that nature, which leads you to think about extinction. And then thirdly, there's enabling conditions. There's different things that have been happening historically that have shaped the way society is structured in such a way that could modulate extinction risk. These 3 factors were largely considered by Torres, who talked a little bit ago. And essentially, these are processed by individuals through sensory perception. And this can lead them to develop what is sometimes referred to a situation model, where the brain is understanding what's happening in the world. And that idea of what's happening into the world can be stored in long-term memory. And so you can have this kind of schemata of what's going on in the world. And when individuals are exposed to triggering factors about thinking about extinction, that input can either be consistent with what they've been exposed to, or it could be something new. And if it changes their mental model of what extinction risk is, the brain would have an error detection mechanism to update the situation model. That would be encoded into long-term memory, and they'd have a new kind of way of thinking about the world. And that world model is going to drive their behavior, and that behavior is going to lead to different coping mechanisms that can affect health, which are called allosteric health effects. And these can lead to mental health problems and also physical health problems. And then, of course, human behavior can feed back right onto the actual extinction threat environment, as humans can be one of the greatest drivers of extinction risk. And the idea here is that physicians can intervene at various levels in this different model. They can address the downstream health effects, or they can address the extinction exposum itself. They could also try to engage in behavioral interventions and things of that nature. Next slide. And to conclude, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the concept of extinction medicine itself is somewhat risky, because we want to avoid causing more harm than there already is. We don't want to make the problem worse and end up facilitating iatrogenesis. And so with extinction, it's very difficult to test interventions because you can't exactly see what happens, if extinction happens. And this is just something we have to be particularly cautious about. And that's it for me. All right, so our next presenter is Dr. Robert Ball. He is a physician and assistant adjunct professor in the Department of Public Health Sciences and the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. Previously, he was on the faculty at the University of South Carolina School of Public Health and School of Medicine. He served as medical director of 2 statewide pandemic influenza task forces and has published dozens of articles and 2 textbook chapters.
Thank you very much, Devin, and kudos to you and Molly and Dr. Brian and others for this great webinar. Next slide, please. First title was Why Should Physicians Care? That's the title of my article in the special issue in August of the Journal of Ethics. And it starts with the classic virtues that we know here on the slide that Dr. Brian has covered. But I'm going to focus on wisdom and courage, particularly courage, which is nowadays that is translated to speak truth to apparent power. Next slide. The epigraph in my article starts off with one of my favorite quotes, Neil deGrasse Tyson: scientific literacy is an intellectual vaccine against the charlatans who would exploit ignorance. And what we have regarding public health, particularly in this country, is a good example of this. But the other 2 quotes are equally poignant. Wisdom outweighs any wealth, Sophocles, and patience is a companion of wisdom, St. Augustine. All of which strike home. Next slide. I'm going to get a bit more concrete here with some major, not all, but major existential threats. I was asked to write a paper about pandemics, which have been the focus of my career, being a 7th generation physician of infectious diseases and public health, focused on pandemics, particularly viral pandemics, but we all know they're unlikely to result in mass global depopulation of Homo sapiens. Sapiens in quote here because I'm not sure that most of the population of this earth are sapient any longer. Next major threat, climate change, appears in my paper. So how did I get from pandemics to climate change, morphing into bigger and bigger threats? And climate change is certainly greater. And that may certainly result in partial depopulation of major areas of the earth. But we all know there are going to be pockets of humans existing, but they won't be of high intelligence. We also have pandemics of mis and disinformation. And I put DYS in there because that is dystopian to say the least, as we'll see in a moment. And these lead to severe risk, epistemic risk to all of us. We also have the rise of superintelligent, agentic, or autonomous artificial intelligence of greater and greater threat. And if it can be harnessed correctly, may help in the future, but may harm more. And of course, we're all experiencing geopolitical hyperpartisanship and politicization, which are leading to increasing regional wars, which, God forbid, leads to a nuclear war, which itself could certainly lead to extinction. Next slide. So in this Anthropocene epoch, which is sadly in some quarters of the world becoming more anti-science by some leaders, we have to learn about these threats. And a term I use for my students is being intellectually curious. We can and should cite evidence that suggests that we are now causing the sixth mass extinction. And I strongly recommend this article by Barnowski and colleagues in Nature. It's in the article in Journal of Ethics also. We must learn to counter mis and disinformation. And here, disinformation refers to the nefarious use of misinformation for personal, political, or financial gain, or all of the above. On a positive side, we need to foster collaboration, certainly, and we need to promote funding and resources and strengthen our scientific organizations. And we need to practice and preach what we've learned. In other words, do something rather than just simply absorb knowledge and pontificate. Next slide. This is a slide from slide decks that I've been showing for decades to students, medical, undergraduate, graduate, postgrad, you name it, and to teach the global unthinkable. We all know that the etymology of the word of a doctor derives from the verb docere, which means to teach, not to heal, but to teach. First, we must learn, and then we must teach. And we must teach the hazards of nuclear war and every aspect humanly possible. Next slide. I have to show a bit of levity in this kind of depressing topic here about human extinction. This is a cartoon, an old cartoon. Here's the world. And the scientists are saying the bad news is you have advanced stage humans. The good news is they've just about run their course and you should be on the mend soon. So with that and knowing the hour, I shall turn it to the last slide. And I thank you for your attention. And next slide, I think there's one more. Yes. One of my favorite quotes, Edmund Burke, those who carry on great public schemes must be proof against the most fatiguing delays, the most mortifying disappointments, the most shocking insults, and what is worst of all, the presumptuous judgments of the ignorant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ball, for that talk. Our last speaker before closing comments will be Guy Riley. Guy is a medical student at the Ohio State University College of Medicine in Columbus with master's degree in immunology from Harvard Medical School and music from the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Carnegie Mellon University. Guy.
Hi, thank you, Devin, for that introduction. So yes, I'm Guy. My talk is going to be based on a paper that my co-authors and I have published, which is Why and How Should Physicians Mitigate Threats of Nuclear War? Next slide, please. So people often think of nuclear war as a political issue, solely political issue, and something that's like outside of the physician's work. After all, our job is to diagnose, treat patients using medical knowledge and skills, but our role as physicians, it's broader, meaning we care about preventing diseases. We also want to protect our patients from the threats to their health, which include nuclear war. And one reason why physicians should act now to prevent nuclear war is because one is they have a long proven record of addressing nuclear threats. And there's multiple list of examples. I just want to point out a few. One is in the 1960s, doctors found high levels of radioactive material in children's baby teeth because of nuclear tests that have been going on. And that data convinced President John F. Kennedy to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which put an end to all the above ground nuclear testing. So that's one example. Another example is IPPNW, the group, has been participated and engaged in a lot of nuclear disarmament movement, which later earned the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. Another reason why physicians should act now is because the risk of nuclear war is arguably the highest since the Cold War. The doomsday clock is now 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been in history. And there are currently more than 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world right now that are capable of causing mass casualties, radiation, climate disruption, famine, humanitarian crisis overall. Next slide, please. So we can talk about 4 fundamental principles of medical ethics. And we can use these to highlight why physicians should engage in advocacy to prevent nuclear war. First, beneficence and non-maleficence, meaning do good and do no harm to our patients. Physicians understand the devastating health effects of nuclear war, and that knowledge obligates us to act now to prevent these harms from ever reaching our patients and our communities. Next, we can think about justice, which justice reminds us to consider the opportunity cost of nuclear weapons spending. Billions of dollars that go into maintaining and developing these weapons. And this money could be better spent or invested in healthcare, education, and social services that actually improve people's lives. Finally, respect for autonomy, meaning patients deserve to make informed choices regarding their health and their well-being. And that means physicians must speak with our communities about the health consequences of nuclear weapons and military spending so that people can make informed decisions, including at the ballot box when they're voting. Next slide. So with all that said, lastly, there are some tangible action items that physicians can take. And honestly, this is not really limited to physicians. It can, a lot of healthcare professionals and even students can take these actions and engage in this anti-nuclear war movement. There are several bills that you can support. You can contact your representatives and senators to urge them to sponsor these. And after my talk, we'll go over in depth like which bills we want to highlight. There are also several advocacy groups, including IPPNW, PSR, Back from the Brink, that you can be part of and support their work. And after my talk, more information about Back from the Brink will be shared with you. And again, you can mobilize the health institutions that you're part of, your colleagues, to raise awareness of these bills and convince them to support these bills. And you can also consider having some conversations about the opportunity costs of nuclear weapons spending, because that affects ultimately how patients have access to their care. And there's a lot of room for improvement regarding our healthcare system in the United States. Yeah, next slide, please. And I think this is a very nice quote from Dr. Bernard Lowe, who's a co-founder of IPPNW. We physicians who shepherd human life from birth to death have a moral imperative to resist with all our being the drift towards the brink. I think it summarizes or it reminds us healthcare professionals, physicians, to remember what it's like to be a physician and what it means to protect and help our patients and our communities. Thank you. Oh, and special thanks to my co-authors, Devin and Arthur, or Trey, and our mentor, Dr. Joseph Hodgkin, and of course, Molly, for all the support and guidance on this topic and work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy, for that interesting talk. We're going to move on to some concluding remarks, and we're going to start with a video. Hopefully it will play about the U.S. Back from the Brink movement that has been affiliated to some degree with Physicians for Social Responsibility and International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. All right, so it looks like we're having some technical difficulties with the video. I'll put it in the chat for people to watch.
Today, the threat
and we can go ahead and move to the next slide.
than it has been in decades.
All right, so Guy mentioned 2 key resolutions in the United States for making progress towards reducing the risk of nuclear war. These are SRES 323 and HRES 317. I wanted to encourage you to call the Capitol switchboard and ask to be connected to your representative's office. You can ask for an aide working on defense and international issues and request your representative to sponsor the bill. If you have any other ideas about how to build the Back from the Brink movement and help get these resolutions through the House and the Senate, please do reach out. I also want to mention again Physicians for Social Responsibility. This is IPPNW's US affiliate, and if people would like to get involved with them, that would be good as well. And I also want to mention the upcoming IPPNW 24th World Congress, which will be hosted in Nagasaki. Registration is still open, and it will be taking place from October 2nd to 4th this year. And there will also be a student congress, I believe, on the 1st of October. And lastly, I wanted to talk about a new initiative that the IPPNW medical student movement is starting. It's going to be called the Extinction Medicine Reading Group, and it will be a partnership with the Ethics of Human Extinction Reading Group, which was running for about a year recently. We're going to have our first meeting on September 6th at 11 a.m. These meetings are going to be held every first and third Saturday of the month. The first meeting is going to discuss the paper Ending Nuclear Weapons Before They End Us, and we're going to have several IPPNW members present. And the first meeting of every month will focus more on the medical and scientific and advocacy aspects of preventing human extinction and managing extinction-related issues, whereas the third meeting or the second meeting of the month on the third Saturday will focus on the ethics of human extinction. And for that, it will be on September 20th at 11 a.m. And we're going to be featuring Dr. Kritika Maheshwari, who's going to be speaking on long-termism and perfection. If you'd like to sign up for either reading group, you can visit the link here, and that will also be on the recording afterwards. And you can also email Dr. Emil P. Torres at philosophytorres@gmail.com. And just a reminder that the special issue is live online now. Just like to encourage you to check out the articles to learn more about some of the presentations today. Next slide. And finally, we're just going to leave on the screen here various different links for you to get involved, read the special issue, join back from the Brink Physicians for Social Responsibility or IPPNW, and consider attending the World Congress, and also consider getting involved with the reading groups to learn more about these issues. There's a lot in this seminar, but there's so much more that wasn't covered, and I encourage you to learn more and help us figure out these important issues. Thank you. Have a great night.